I'm the executive director here at SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. We have convened this webinar today on the conflict in the Caucasus to discuss the geopolitical implications, the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And this conflict had been a frozen conflict for a long time, for decades. But in recent years, there have been tensions, and just a couple months ago, major conflict restarted, hot conflict. And we have two very, very qualified experts. It's hard to find experts on this topic, so we are very appreciative of their time and their willingness to join us. We have Thomas de Waal. He's a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe. And then we have Luke Coffey. He's the director of Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And just as we were discussing prior to starting the session, there are ongoing developments. The most recent news from the ground is the fall of this region called Shusha. It's a strategically important location, and Azerbaijani forces have been marching forward in recent weeks, and this would be significant. So, as I will confess my lack of expertise in this region and in this topic, and I will definitely defer to my analysts, and I will ask them questions. And if they find it too simple, they'll not hesitate to tell me. But we want to focus on what this conflict means strategically, where it could end, where it could lead to, and what it means for the region. There are several important players in the region, and then there's also Western interests, NATO, US leadership. It has implications for those as well. So we'll try to get to all these topics. Without further ado, I want to start with Tom to give us his take on yesterday's developments in Shusha, and what it means for the conflict, and then we'll move on to other topics. Thank you for joining us. Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kadir, for the invitation, and glad to be with you. As you say, it's a very fateful day, I think, in the conflict. News is emerging, not yet fully confirmed, but I think mostly confirmed, of the fall of the city of Shusha, which Armenians call Shushi, in the middle of Karabakh. And I can't overstate the importance of this place. It's the hilltop citadel right in the middle of Karabakh. It overlooks the main Armenian city, Stepanakert. It was the former Azerbaijani majority town, a place of huge significance, in particular for Azerbaijanis. Its cultural significance, a place, birthplace of musicians and poets. So when President Aliyev first announced yesterday that Shusha had been taken, there was jubilation in the streets of Baku and across Azerbaijan. This is an enormous development. Today, coincidentally, is Azerbaijani Flag Day. I think the Azerbaijanis were pushing to take Shusha today and to raise the flag there today. So I think, if confirmed, a hugely important development, a big Azerbaijani victory, but also in its way quite a ominous move for the Armenians, now that we have Azerbaijani forces in the heart of Karabakh, a possible humanitarian disaster for the remaining thousands of Armenians inside Karabakh. It's both kind of important and also, I think, much messier now, the conflict. Hopefully we will see, maybe now that President Aliyev has achieved this enormous objective, a halt in the fighting, because I believe if it goes on, it gets increasingly messy. There could be desperate measures taken by Armenians there, and as I say, thousands of civilians cut off, winter approaching. So I think that's the first thing to say here. Obviously, we'll talk about the the diplomacy. But I think that with this news, if this news is confirmed, we're certainly not going back to the status quo ante. We're entering a whole new phase of this conflict in which Azerbaijan has scored a victory, but also has taken on enormous new responsibilities in this conflict.
Thomas, let me ask you, you said we are not going back to the status quo. Can you talk about the status quo? What was the status quo actually?
Well, I mean, when we talk about this incredibly complicated dispute, which goes back a century, really, one of the world's most disputed regions, we understand what an intractable conflict this is. And it's always been a very maximalist conflict in which third parties have never really had a say unless they were the third party, imperial party who was imposing order. This is a region which has both enormous importance, both for Armenians historically and also for Azerbaijanis. And so, of course, no democracy in the Soviet Union, so it was never settled by dialogue. It could only really be settled, the dispute, by maximalist positions. And in the 90s, that maximalist position played out in favor of the Armenian side, who won the war comprehensively of the 1990s, taking not just Karabakh itself, but 7 surrounding Azerbaijani regions, which were not under dispute. So this was the frozen conflict, as it were, quote unquote, because of course it was never completely frozen, with the Armenians controlling all this territory, but disputed, of course, by Azerbaijan, disputed under international law, and we never, unfortunately, saw what I wanted, which was a serious and comprehensive peace process between the sides. So the risk was always that it would be settled not as was desirable at the negotiation table, but on the battlefield. And this is what we've seen since the end of September with this very successful Azerbaijani offensive, successful, of course, in military terms, but hugely costly in human terms. We're getting figures from the Armenian side of casualties, around 1,300 military dead in 6 weeks, and maybe 50, 70 civilian casualties. We have civilian casualties on the Azerbaijani side of about 90 plus, and we don't have the military casualties, which I suspect are higher on the Azerbaijani side. So certainly it's unfrozen in a most dramatic way. And if you look at the geography of this conflict, and you have 2 militaries engaged with one another, it's going to be an enormous diplomatic and political effort to disengage those armies and to kind of provide protection for the civilians who remain.
Luke, I want to ask you a couple things about what Tom said, but before that, what is your take about Shusha's fall, and how do you see conflict evolving?
Well, firstly, I want to thank you, Kader, for inviting me back here to speak, and thanks, Etta, for organizing this timely discussion today. I agree with what Tom said about the war has entered a new phase. I think Shusha was always at least in the first phase of the conflict, the main objective of Azerbaijan. The fact that it has been liberated means that certain considerations will have to be taken by Baku on the way going forward. Of course, winter is approaching. The vast majority of civilians that have decided to remain behind are in Stepanakert, which is a mere 10 to 15 kilometers away from Shusha. It's unclear precisely how many civilians have decided to stay behind, but we know it is a significant amount. And right now, I think the main focus, at least on the Azerbaijani side, should be to find a way to consolidate their military gains while keeping a humanitarian corridor open through Lachin back into Armenia. The more civilians that are able to get out, and the better and safer the passage for these civilians to get out of the conflict zone, the better. And one thing Azerbaijan, I think, needs to be really focused on and start planning for now is the humanitarian consequences of the approaching winter. I saw, one never knows how accurate the weather forecasts are, but I checked on my phone for Shusha, and the first snow I saw is predicted for this coming weekend. So we are entering a phase in the conflict where I think a lot of the kinetic, the hardcore fighting between the two sides will slowly start to die out just because of the realities on the ground. But the risk to the civilians becomes even greater.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this is a new phase in this conflict, and Azerbaijan's President Aliyev had an interview. I think, Thomas, you tweeted that out as well, and he seems to be intent on liberating all the regions that are under Armenian occupation around Karabakh, and he wants some sort of commitment from the Armenian side, and that would be his condition to stop. So where do you think, Luke, if they have this momentum, yes, it might, kind of slow down militarily because of sort of the winter approaching. Are there serious considerations for them to try to stop, like when you called for consolidating those military wins? Why is that? Like, what is the incentive to stop now or slow down now?
Well, I don't, if there's no meaningful overture of diplomacy from Armenia's side, I don't think that Azerbaijan will slow down purposely. But I do think because of if you look at the way the thrusts have been made in this conflict, and if you look at the terrain and the geography, and then you look at the concentration of the civilian population that remains, and then you look at the weather forecasts, I think these other considerations might slow it down, but I don't think it's going to stop it. Mm-hmm. I think the sooner that the leadership in Yerevan realizes that the situation on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 surrounding districts is fundamentally changed, and it's essentially at this point a lost cause, the better. A lot of young men and women from both sides are dying every single day, and the only outcome that can prevent this needless loss of life will be some sort of negotiated settlement. And right now, I would say that Azerbaijan's playing with a stronger hand. In the interview that you mentioned, Kader, it was a BBC interview. I think that's the one we're all talking about here. That's and right. President Aliyev said that if Armenia commits to a timetable of withdrawal, then that could stop the fighting. So it's not even, according to what he has said, and I can only take it at face value because it came from him in the interview, but it's not even, Azerbaijan doesn't even want to see all the troops leave before they stop fighting. They just want a timetable and to see a process implemented. And because the facts have changed on the ground and the tactical situation is so different from before, I don't see any other choice for Armenia and the Armenian-backed officials in Nagorno-Karabakh than to achieve some sort of negotiated settlement. That would be the best thing for all the young men fighting on the front lines and for the civilians that are caught in the middle.
Yeah. Thomas, how do you see that the fact that Azerbaijan has the upper hand? And
well, I certainly, thank you. I mean, I certainly agree that Azerbaijan has the upper hand, and I certainly agree that negotiations are absolutely essential. And I think that the Armenian leadership in Yerevan has played this extremely badly by not calling for more openly for negotiations sooner. But I think, I mean, the problem is, of course, this is a very toxic conflict. civilians have been hit on both sides, but there's zero trust between the sides. And of course, the fear all along amongst the Armenians of Karabakh is that they would be destroyed by Azerbaijan. This may sound strange to some people watching, but this is the kind of the reality that they've lived with, and they would mention what happened to them in 1991 or 1992 when the Azerbaijani side almost overwhelmed them. So this has always, I think, been a zero-sum conflict, and obviously we all want to see a kind of an equitable solution, but it's much easier said than done. And of course, personally, I also want to see withdrawal from those occupied territories as well. But hand in hand, one would want to see some kind of security mechanisms to protect those Armenians of Karabakh, and this has always been a difficult issue. Who would protect them? Again, we can start to speculate, and I'm sure we will discuss this, about some kind of peacekeeping force, rumors of even of a Russian-Turkish mixed peacekeeping force, which would be quite controversial. But I think this is the issue: is that there is zero trust amongst the Armenians of Karabakh for what Azerbaijan's intentions are for them. So to withdraw, particularly for those two territories, Lachin and Kelbajar, which connect Karabakh and Armenia, means to withdraw your connection with Armenia. This is where the problem lies. Maybe they have no alternative. Maybe they're simply their backs are against the wall. But I think this is how they see it. So I'm, to be honest, not surprised that they haven't yet agreed to this timetable for withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. There was in these 6 principles by the Minsk group, the recent fighting, recent gains by Azerbaijan, does that make it at least partially meaningless, those principles? Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that, Kadir. Yes, I think it does. I mean, the 6 principles date back to 2006, 2007. They were a kind of balanced set of principles, a framework for resolving the conflict. But obviously, they were designed at a situation when the conflict was in favor of the Armenians, the status quo on the ground. And then I think it was Mr. Pashinyan's strategic mistake in the last year or so to start walking away from those principles, believing, I think, that the situation was in the Armenians' favor, which was one of them, the triggers for this conflict. And now in this, what we've seen in the last 6 weeks is the Azerbaijani side, if not so much in word, but in deed, also saying that they don't want to honor those principles. In the BBC interview, in the longer transcript, which I would encourage you to read, Mr. Aliyev is equivocal when asked about what kind of autonomy the Karabakh Armenians would get. That was one of the principles. Talking about withdrawal from Lachin, that's one of the principles. It's supposed to be a corridor between Armenia and Karabakh. So both sides have really walked away from that framework. And the new framework is, as it were, being set on the battlefield. And hopefully, diplomacy has really been very weak so far in the last 6 weeks. Hopefully, we're going to see some stronger diplomacy now to kind of try and deal with these new realities.
Luke, Thomas mentioned that the most recent kind of it was reported in the in media in Middle East Eye that there was this plan that Turks and Russians would kind of act as peacekeeping forces on the ground, and then there would be connections between Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan, and Armenia would remain connected to Karabakh, if I didn't misunderstand that part. But Luke, how do you see that plan being realistically implemented, given that, like Thomas said, the Minsk Group's 6 principles have largely been sort of past story?
Yeah, I read that report as well. On the corridor issue, I think it's sort of like a right of access or a right of transit that would go through Armenia to Nakhchivan and then transit Lachin to Nagorno-Karabakh. It wouldn't be like a swap. or anything like that. I think that's probably important to stress. Although this was reported in the Middle East Eye, I haven't seen any other like reports coming from state media out of Moscow. Perhaps I missed them, but I haven't seen that. And I'm not sure where this is going. If this was you know, a trial balloon, someone floated up to see how people would react. But I do believe with this fundamental idea that only Ankara and Moscow right now have the authority and the influence and the clout over Yerevan and Baku to force the sides into some sort of meaningful and enduring peace arrangement. Yes, you know, the Minsk group is still exists. Turkey, of course, not being a co-chair, but part of the Minsk group has a role. But if this conflict has taught us anything, it's that the Minsk group has ultimately been a failure, and perhaps it's time to think of new, more flexible, contemporary, and creative frameworks to deal with finding a negotiated settlement. But in terms of the basic principles and the confidence building, the whole point of the basic principles originally was to build confidence, a phased approach to the end of the conflict where 5 of the 7 surrounding districts would Armenian and Armenian-backed forces would leave, and then a corridor between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh would be established and protected. And then the 2 other districts would see a withdrawal and be returned back to Azerbaijani control. And then IDPs would return back to their homes. And you had all these steps of confidence building until you got to the top of the mountain, which was the final settlement of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think that the negotiators at the time wisely left that kind of separate in a way. I mean, it was never separate in the minds of the negotiators, but at least publicly, in what was said, it was treated separately. But now, you know, depending on which internet sleuth that uses Google Earth to geolocate every single video and picture taken of the conflict, depending on which maps you look at, Azerbaijan pretty much controls 4 out of the 5 of the first districts that were meant to be the first part of the confidence building of the basic principles. So the situation has completely changed. But what hasn't changed is, I think, this willingness by Baku to see a phased resolution to this. And I think that's quite something when you look at the military success they have had, that they're still talking about a willingness to see like a phased outcome, a timetable for withdrawal, not an actual withdrawal, leaving the questions of autonomy or whatnot to of Nagorno-Karabakh to another date. So we'll have to see where it goes. I'm not sure, but going back to your original question, that specific report you mentioned, I haven't seen anything else other than what was reported by the Middle East Eye.
Well, part of the reason I brought that up is you know, there's also a question about this. So Russia's approach has been interesting in the most recent round of conflict since the fall. Many, at least outside observers, expected perhaps that Russia would simply intervene and stop both sides and go back to the status quo, but we haven't seen that happening. And on the contrary, Putin said, well, these are Azerbaijani lands. So what is Russia's position? One of the questions is, will Russia press Azerbaijan to stop? But of course, we have to rewind a bit. Why hasn't, you know, Russia intervened in a way to stop Azerbaijan from advancing further? How do you see Russia's position, Luke?
I think Russia is in a difficult position. And I think this is one of the factors. This was one of the factors when Baku decided to take the military option that they did. They see a Moscow that is preoccupied and struggling in other places around the world. Syria is becoming an increasingly complicated issue for Russia, and how long they want to maintain its Russia wants to maintain its support and for Bashar al-Assad. Russia has had some setbacks in Libya. The war in eastern Ukraine is not letting up, and the occupation of Crimea is costing the state coffers billions of dollars every single year. It seems like in Belarus, you have a population that across the board is very sympathetic, if not pro-Russian, but yet Moscow, for whatever reason, and there are reasons, but they've decided to back a loser at the risk of losing the goodwill that Russia enjoys throughout most of the population of Belarus. You had you've had Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in the Turkic Council make statements supporting Azerbaijan's territorial integrity in this conflict, which is counter to at least the spirit of the CSTO arrangement in terms of backing another member, at least politically or rhetorically backing another member of the CSTO. So I think that, and then you have the domestic issues, the civil unrest in some parts of Russia, the international outcry from the poisoning of Navalny, the drop in the price of oil, the surge in COVID cases. Russia is busy. Russia is very preoccupied right now. And the last thing Russia probably wants is this problem in the South Caucasus. So that is at least how I see Russia's position, is they don't want to get too involved if they can avoid it. They don't need another major problem on their hands. And as a result, they're using these technicalities, some valid ones in my opinion, but nevertheless technicalities about the CSTO agreement about, well, this isn't happening inside Armenia proper. And I think Armenians I must feel very exposed out on a limb because of this. And I don't think it's going to impact, at least in the short term, Russian-Armenian relations, but in the long term, this could have a detrimental impact. And it could also impact how Russia is perceived by other countries in the region as well. But one thing I often like to stress is that this notion, this idea that NATO, because of Turkey's membership and the CSTO because of Russia, that NATO and Russia are about ready to enter a conflict because of all these other powers involved in the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh is absolutely ridiculous. And we should remember that for both NATO's Article 5 and the CSTO, I think it's Article 4, I could be wrong in terms of the mutual security clause, it's not an automatic trigger. You know, ultimately, whenever a security alliance, an intergovernmental security alliance like NATO decides to implement the security clause, it's a political decision. Ultimately, there's no trigger, there's no tripwire, there's no, so I think in terms of the threat of the US and Russia going to war ultimately because of some fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, I think that's very far-fetched, and we should all refrain from saying such things. But I still read it all the time. So,
of course. Thank you, Luke, for that answer. Thomas, the same question. What has been
Sure.
Russia's role, and how do you see them? Why haven't they intervened? And
I mean, I think Russia has always wanted an equilibrium in this conflict, and has had one for well, if you count the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership for 30 years, and has been able to use that equilibrium to maintain more or less okay relations with Azerbaijan and its traditional relationship with Armenia at the same time. And that has been Russia's kind of influence in this conflict. That influence has now been upset by this Azerbaijani military offensive with the support of Turkey, which is the big new factor here. And I think I would agree with Luke. Russia has a lot on its plate, and also does not want to go to war with Azerbaijan. I mean, and the implication, Russia, remember, has a border with Azerbaijan. It does not have a border with Armenia. That border runs with the North Caucasus, with Dagestan. That could be seriously destabilizing the North Caucasus if Russia was to intervene on the Armenian side. what I think Russia's agenda here has been for the last few years has to be to have a settlement which involves Russian peacekeepers. This is the so-called Lavrov plan. It was to have a peaceful settlement which opened up communications of Russia to the south and also involved got Russian boots back on the ground. They haven't been there since the early 90s. I think that was the Russia agenda. And we're still seeing this agenda amazingly being pursued. Apparently in the talks in Moscow on October the 10th, it was again raised by the Russian side. And now we're seeing it coming with these conversations with the Turks as well, some kind of idea of some kind of mixed peacekeeping force, perhaps Russians on the Armenian side, Turks on the Azerbaijani side. You know, it's not the worst plan in the world if you want to stop ethnic cleansing and stop and protect civilians. But there are many problems with it. You're getting two big power neighbors with their own agendas in on the ground, dictating a peace over the heads of Armenians and Azerbaijani civilians. So it's not something I personally would favor. I would personally much favor a return to a stronger multilateral process. I would like to see the US, which has been very much engaged, get back in. I would like to see more European nations involved. But I think the Russians have played quite a skillful game with Turkey, perhaps, of kind of blocking those Western partners out. And I think this is where, and I think they're winning that game. I don't see Western nations having much traction. If we're going to see a Biden administration, obviously they won't be up and running for 2 or 3 months. So certainly that seems to be the way things are going. And let me just, if you'll forgive me, a moment of history. The last time Turkey had its troops in the Caucasus was exactly 1 century ago. They basically left in November 1920. They stopped fighting anyway when the Russian Bolsheviks came over the mountains into Armenia and stopped the Turkish advance into Armenia. This was Karabakir's Kemalist army for the Turkish citizens who are watching. They've been out of this, but then you had the Treaty of Kars, which was basically a kind of deal between Lenin and Ataturk on setting the new borders of the Caucasus. And again, the agenda there was to do it between Russia and Turkey and to kind of keep the Western powers out. So we're seeing a bit of history repeating itself. And for those of us who care about Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and would like to see a more European process there, a more Western agenda there, this is not something that I personally would welcome. This kind of if again using history, even further back history, the Sultan and the Tsar deciding what happens in the Caucasus. For me, this is maybe it's what we're going to see, but it's a step backwards as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you for that, Thomas. It was interesting in the same interview with Aliyev. He talked about he opposed internationalization of the conflict, but at the same time he reserved sort of the right to call on Turkey if there's any need for help. But he didn't see that happening anytime soon. So that was interesting. One of the questions is about Turkey's role. Let me read that to you and ask you, Luke. Well, actually, the question is to both of you. So if you're willing to answer that, that's fine. Why do you think? What do you think about the calculation in Ankara for such a high degree of involvement in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? Turkey seems stretched in Libya, Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, and a very challenging economic situation at home. So how do you see Turkey's role so far? And there are obviously energy interests, strategic landscape, but also at home, there's a high level of support for, basically we consider, it's the famous motto, one nation, two states. Turkey at home, there's a public opinion strongly on the side of Azerbaijan as well. So I'll go to Luke for this, and then Thomas, if you want to add anything, please. Luke.
Yeah, of course. of course, Turkey, like Russia, has a lot going on around the world, and often they have a lot going on together in these different places. Even Ukraine, when President Erdogan and President Zelensky met recently and signed new arms deals, and it was very effective TB2 drones and a whole package of support. And of course, Turkey has been one of the most outspoken supporters of the Crimean Tatars, who face religious persecution and cultural persecution in occupied Crimea. So Syria, Libya, Ukraine, the South Caucasus, of course. You've always what we're seeing, I think, is just a continuation of history. For the past couple of years, certainly in Washington, there was this narrative that this is a bromance between President Erdogan and President Putin is a fundamental shift in the geopolitics of the region. And I would, I only think this would be the case if you also agree that we are going to undo about 300 years of history, where Russia and Turkey have been natural competitors, often in conflict in these regions, especially the South Caucasus. As Thomas mentioned, 100 years ago this month was when the last time the Turks were present in terms of boots on the ground in Azerbaijan. But Turkey is always, because of that cultural and that linguistic and that historical connection with Azerbaijan, has always had Azerbaijan's back, so to speak. I think in the part of the question about does this burden Turkey to the point where it can't, focus on other regions or its other challenges in the Eastern Med or Syria or whatever, I would say no, because I think that Turkey's support of Azerbaijan is baked in to their policy formulation and their population. It doesn't matter, across the board politically, for the most part, AK, CHP, it doesn't matter. They're supporting Turkey's support for Azerbaijan. And actually, Turkish support for Azerbaijan in this conflict comes at a relatively low cost. They sold weapons. They actually got money in return, as opposed to gifting weapons to Azerbaijan. They get to see, the Turkish defense industry is benefiting from this, because nothing sells a piece of military kit like a combat-proven tag you can put on it. And if we know anything, it's that these drones are very effective from the hours of footage that has been released. So I think Turkey sees what is happening positively. And I think that perhaps looking back in the future, when we look back on this conflict and the origins of this most recent round of fighting, it will be a complete failure of Armenian intelligence, or at least Armenian statescraft, to recognize the not only enthusiasm but the level of support that Turkey was willing to give to Azerbaijan, in contrast to that lukewarm support, standoffish support that Russia gave to Armenia, certainly in the earlier days of this fighting.
Thank you. Thomas?
Sure, yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm not a big Turkey expert. I used to spend a lot of time in Turkey, but the Turkish foreign policy I'm familiar with is out of date, which was political support for Azerbaijan, but pursuing a peaceful settlement of the conflict. I mean, I would say I'd make a slightly different point, which is that there may be, I'm looking for the right word, maybe a slightly Mephistophelian pact here that Azerbaijan has made with Erdogan's Turkey. I would remind you, obviously, the two nations are very close. They speak virtually the same language, the strong Turkic bond. But the leaderships have fairly different agendas, or in many different places. It's still a very secular leadership in Azerbaijan, and still quite a Shiite country. So President Erdogan is bringing something different here. He's bringing the Middle East into this conflict. We haven't discussed these Syrian fighters, and I try not to touch this issue, but I recently read that the the report by Syrians for Truth and Justice. I believe the NGO is called, a 50-page report with lots of interviews, flight data, videos, very, very detailed information about these Syrians who, I think there's no doubt that they are there in Azerbaijan. These reports from Syria itself are very, very detailed. So that's also bringing a new element into Azerbaijan. And of course, President Aliyev is riding high now in Azerbaijan with the whole public. He can do no wrong. But in the longer term, this influence may be running contrary to his own vision of what he wants to do in Azerbaijan, this more Sunni Islamist Erdogan vision. So I think President Aliyev is riding high at the moment, but in a couple of years' time, he may have mobilized the public in a way that he's not so comfortable with, and he may have imported this kind of Turkish agenda into Azerbaijan in a way he's not so comfortable with either.
Luke, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. There was a question about this Syria thing, so you've discussed that, Thomas. I think I want to move to other question. There are several questions. We are witnessing heightened efforts from the Armenian diaspora for international recognition of Artsakh. Because of these diasporic pressures, there are more calls from large Western powers for Azerbaijani forces to cease fighting, and a US city, Glendale, admittedly with a high Armenian population, has officially recognized Artsakh. Will Western pressure and diasporic influence have any legitimate impact on the conflict? Luke, this is US domestic politics. I don't know how much you want to dwell on it, but briefly, perhaps.
Yeah, I understand the emotional drive behind some of these views and this activism. I completely get it. But recognizing a new country, Artsakh, is not going to change the facts on the ground. And Glendale, or whatever municipality in the United States, can pass whatever resolution they want, and it doesn't change the situation. And I understand how the Armenian Americans who have that close connection to Armenia, and they perhaps have traveled back there, and of course they're concerned. If seeing what's on social media, seeing the international news, what is happening, it's only normal for them to be concerned about their ancestral homeland. But sometimes I feel like the diaspora groups, they profit, they make money, fundraise, and development by throwing fuel on that fire. And I think that in terms of the national debate we have in the United States on what role the U.S. as a nation should take in this conflict, I think maybe sometimes that can be slightly skewed. And we see this on Capitol Hill, where you have a very influential Armenian American lobbyist groups who they benefit from throwing fuel on this fire. So I think we all have to be understanding. And look, I myself have been the target of a lot of harassment and social media attacks and everything. And I understand where this is coming from, how these Armenian Americans must feel, and I try to be compassionate about that. But these organizations, these diaspora organizations, have a responsibility too, not to just make a very volatile situation worse.
Yeah. Luke,
can I come in on that just quickly?
Sure.
I mean, as someone who knows this Armenian question quite well, I mean, I've also observed several conflicts, and I think it's true to say that the closer you are to the fighting, the more you want the fighting to stop. And often people thousands of miles away are the ones who are urging it on. But the people who are fighting on the ground, whether they be Azerbaijanis or Armenians, are the ones who really want it to stop. And I think it does them no favors, some of this rhetoric coming from across the ocean or from far away. I mean, I think the diaspora can play a positive political role by advocating helping Armenia to negotiate, advocating the position of the Karabakh Armenians in the humanitarian situation, their political rights, calling out violations of international humanitarian law and so on. I think that should be their role rather than calling for this recognition of Artsakh. And I mean, I think I would also say to any Azerbaijanis who are watching, this obviously, what happens now, Armenians are not going to give up on Karabakh. It has an enormous importance for them as a place. So if Azerbaijan can de-escalate a bit from what they've been doing in recent weeks, and offer even some glimpse of hope for the Armenians of Karabakh, then that would actually benefit Azerbaijan as well as the Armenians.
Thomas, how are things looking from Europe? One of the questions is about that. Minsk group proved unsuccessful. Is there a need for a new platform? And if there is, what would be European Union's role in that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think when the Minsk group was founded in 1992 and then was given its proper mandate in 1994, there were great hopes on the OSCE as this new European security organization, which would take on a leading role in Europe, would be a kind of European United Nations, would have some kind of security role. That hasn't happened, unfortunately, and I think the weakness of the Minsk group is also located within that bigger problem of the OSCE. And so you've got European nations which want to do more. I'm particularly thinking of Sweden, Finland, Germany, which are in the Minsk group, but are not Minsk group co-chairs, but have been, as it were, denied a more active role. And I think that's a shame. So I think it would be still possible not to abolish the Minsk group, but as it were, to give more influence and a voice to the ordinary members of the Minsk group, which also include Turkey, of course, not just the co-chair countries. That would be my wish, with American support, for a return to some kind of multilateral format. But as we've already discussed here, I think things are moving in a different direction. I think the big regional powers seem to be dictating the game. So I don't see that happening. But personally, I will continue advocating for that. I have some hopes in Sweden, as the new OSCE chairman in office can try and do something on this conflict and try and sort of mitigate some of the worst things happening.
As I said, we are receiving a lot of questions, but let me just ask you, do you think this could be resolved militarily in the end? Like Azerbaijan just doesn't stop and this goes, they get to liberate all 7 regions, and then,
theoretically, yes, Kadir. I mean, all problems can be resolved militarily. But then I would remind you that the Armenians thought they had resolved this in 1994. This was the message I heard so many times in Armenia. Why are you still talking about this? This issue is resolved. It's only all that remains for Azerbaijan to accept the new realities. And when I would say things in Yerevan like this conflict is unsustainable, or no, the occupation of those lands is unsustainable, they would say, seems pretty sustainable to us. So obviously, if Azerbaijan does take over these territories at a great human cost, it would say, well, this is the de jure territory of Azerbaijan. But there are so many disputes around the world. We can name them all: Cyprus, Kashmir, Kosovo. So many disputes where one side has, as it were, lost, but is not giving up. And that would definitely be the case, given Armenians' enormous attachment to Karabakh, the historic meaning, the cultural meaning. If you go there and see all those medieval churches, you understand the meaning of this place for Armenians. So yes, there could theoretically be a military victory, but I don't think, I would say for sure that's not the end of the conflict.
Yeah, regardless of the trajectory of the military offensive, at some point there will need to be a settlement, diplomatic, political settlement. And what format that happens will be important, like you said. There's a bunch of questions. I want to kind of combine them, Luke. So can you review the range of military support to Azerbaijan from Turkey and Israel? Thomas spoke about Turkey's return to the region after 100 years. How many Turkish troops are there present in Azerbaijan now? What roles are they playing? As far as I know, there are no Turkish troops in Azerbaijan. Aliyev also
Trainers, I think,
saying
but rather than troops. Yeah.
What's that?
I was going to say trainers and advisors more than troops on the ground. Yeah.
That's right. And then another question is about, again, Israel's support for Azerbaijan, but Turkey and Israel don't get along. How does this work? And somebody is asking about Iran's role because they're asking about Israel. I wanted to. It's related to Iran question. What is Iran's likely future role in attempts at conflict resolution, and how has their position changed since the 90s? How likely is it that conflict might spill over into the Azeri population in Iran's northwestern territories? So I just kind of see them all connected. That's why I'm dumping them all on you, Luke. But I'll turn to Thomas as well.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, we can have a whole nother panel discussion, I think, to answer those questions. In a nutshell, I'm often asked about this. Well, Israel seems supportive of Azerbaijan, but Turkey and Israel don't get along. And then what about Turkey and Russia? I thought they're supposed to be friends, but look at what they're doing against each other in the South Caucasus. And I say, welcome to the South Caucasus. It's a very complicated region that it's not black or white. There are many shades of gray. And you have to look at maybe some of the reasons why driving some of these relationships. I mean, take Israel and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan provides Israel with about 40% of its crude oil every single year. There's a very large Jewish population in Azerbaijan that is important to Israel. Netanyahu has visited, spent a number of days in Azerbaijan. So they have this sort of strategic partnership. And also, I think, to throw Iran into this, while on the surface, Azerbaijani and Iranian relations are very cordial and somewhat smooth, below the surface, there is a lot of tension there. Some of this is based on the consequences of historical agreements between Imperial Russia and the Persian Empire. Where you have a large number of ethnic Azeris that live in northern Iran. You have as a consequence of international sanctions against Iran over its nuclear program, you had Iran looking all over the place for countries to do some business with, and Armenia was one of them. So Armenia and Iran have had a very cozy relationship in recent years. And I think Israel sees that, and they see that friction that's below the surface between Azerbaijan and Iran. So then they see Azerbaijan as sort of a natural partner in that sense. But in terms of Iran's role in the current fighting, while in the past, Iran has certainly been sympathetic to the Armenian cause, I think they're being more cautious this time around. And for some of the same reasons why I mentioned about Russia's hesitancy, and that is because they too have a lot on their plate right now with everything in the Gulf, across the Middle East, and Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, the economic sanctions, the U.S. withdrawal from JCPOA. So and on top of all of this, if you think about it from Iran's point of view, along their border with Azerbaijan and Armenia, there is now a completely new geopolitical landscape that is unfolding before their eyes. And they're trying to figure out what this means, I think, for their interests in the region as well. And, you've seen on social media videos and reports of Russian resupplies going through Iran into Armenia. You've seen the mobilization of Iranian forces moving north along the Aras River. And I think it's not because Iran is going to get military involved in this conflict. As I said, I think they're trying to figure out how things stand, what the new reality is, and how they need to respond. So yes, the region, is very complicated. It's not clear cut, and that's just the geopolitical reality there.
Thank you, Luke. Thomas.
Well, I think Luke's basically covered it. I mean, Iran, I think, is like Georgia, which hasn't been mentioned, but worth mentioning, a country which neighbors the two countries which neighbor both Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I think they don't want to get anything out of this particularly, rather than avoid a lose-lose, which is the problem. Both countries, both Georgia and Iran, have Armenian and Azeri populations. Both, risk destabilization from this conflict. So I think both are desperately, obviously very different countries in every other respect, but in this conflict, quite similar in that respect. Both desperately wanting to kind of see the conflict stabilize, and avoid big refugee flows, and avoid sort of overflow of the conflict onto their territory.
Mm-hmm. One more thing about U.S. foreign policy. Now, we have a new administration coming in soon, and they have promised to, do more internationally, right? Take, not necessarily in every single conflict subject around the world, but on climate change, NATO, JCPOA, etc. Luke, let me get to you about that. How do you think, if there's a more internationalist U.S. foreign policy, how could that reflect on here? And we know that, incoming administration will want to show some strength against Russia. Could this be this region be a scene where we see bigger sort of U.S. Russia, NATO Russia kind of back and forth? Show, how do you see that?
I think sometimes we Americans need to be a little more aware of the limits of our perhaps power and influence in some places around the world. And I would say the specific conflict that we see today in Nagorno-Karabakh is a good example of this. The United States has a responsibility to play a productive role as one of the three co-chairs in the Minsk group. But this idea that, whether it's under a Trump administration or a Biden administration, that we have some sort of special influence that we're just not using to bring these parties to the negotiating table, I think is fanciful. So I hope that the U.S. will play a constructive role inside the framework of the Minsk group, but it may not be that framework that brings a negotiated settlement about. So the U.S. I think needs to be flexible, but also be realistic about what it can and cannot practically achieve on the ground in the region.
Would you advocate for it to sort of line up next to Turkey in this conflict? Like, how would it really?
No, I think it's in America's interest that there is some sort of a negotiated settlement that can bring in an enduring peace to this part of the South Caucasus. There are very important oil and gas pipelines, fiber optic cables, rail links, motorway that connect the heart of the Eurasian landmass to Southern Europe, which provides an alternative to Russian and Iranian oil and gas to Europe. Europe's energy security is very important to the United States because of our treaty obligations through NATO and our economic connections we have with Europe. I mean, we're each other's #1 trading partners. We're each responsible for the creation of millions of jobs for each other on both sides of the Atlantic. So the US has an interest to ensure that we have a prosperous and stable Europe, and energy security is a key part of that. So anything that the US can do to help bring peace that can create a sort of a pathway to prosperity for the whole region. I mean, just think how many billions of dollars of foreign direct investment must be missed out on in the South Caucasus because of conflicts like this. Mm-hmm. Armenia has missed out on a lot of regional cooperation over the years because of this conflict. And if this conflict can be resolved in an enduring, meaningful way, then I think there could be huge economic opportunities to improve the standard of living and welfare of all the three countries in the region: Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. I think they all can be winners here. But I don't think that, so it's in the US interest to see this realized, but I don't think the US right now has the the power to do so.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Of course, since we are focused on U.S.-Turkey relations at SETA Washington, I was trying to find an area of potential cooperation between U.S. and Turkey. But Thomas, I'll give you the last word. How do you see U.S. potential role in this conflict, in the resolution of this conflict?
Well, the U.S. has traditionally played quite an active role as a mediator in this conflict, but has been very much disengaged under this administration, with one exception, one initiative by John Bolton, I think in 2018. I see them trying to under a Biden administration, there are people who've worked on this conflict who are likely to take jobs in the Biden administration, but I see them trying to reassert a role. But I think the landscape will be quite difficult, quite different and difficult by the time the new administration takes office. I certainly think the US could play a stabilizing role, but I think the main action is now taking place without the US. I would also mention that Georgia is currently in a political crisis, and maybe the US has some more influence there, and hopefully, at least when it comes to Georgia, I think the US can be a calming influence.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Luke. This has been an excellent discussion. We're really lucky to have listened to two top experts in this region in the South Caucasus. We hope some sort of diplomatic solution that's lasting will come soon, so that further, conflict could be prevented. But again, thank you all for joining us to listen to this discussion. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Luke. Hopefully, we'll discuss these issues again in the future. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.